Hello and welcome back again. So, just to quickly recap what we've done so far, we made the entrance area in part 1 and 2 of this mini-series, and the portal room in part 3. So, in this one we're going to make the penultimate room, and for this we're going to use the small passage that we made in part 1. We'll reuse the slightly longer passage that we made in the very first build-along series. We're also going to make another portal piece, as well as the stone doorway that has the handprints and the strange runes carved upon it. And, of course, we'll need to make the room itself, which is what we're going to do next. Okay then, to start things off, we'll need to glue this page to some single corrugated card or similar, basically something that's half as thick as a regular floor tile, and then we're just going to cut that to size. So, yeah, there you go. Then, making sure that we're using a really sharp blade, we'll start the laborious process of cutting out the inside of the broken part of the floor tile. And I have made all of the edges straight lines, just to make this part a little bit easier, but still, it's going to take a while. So, while I'm doing that, I'll fill the dead air by saying that you're welcome to come and join the Discord server or the Facebook community and just chat or share pictures of stuff you've built yourself. And I suppose I should also point out that, like everyone else, I do have a Patreon, which, you know, it's there if that's something you're interested in. But yeah, I'll just fast forward to the part where I'm almost finished. And here I am just popping the whole thing out. And when we're done, we should be left with something like this, which we can then add walls to in the usual fashion. So, to save time, I'll do most of that off camera. So, there you go. But I will glue this last piece into place here, just for the sake of completeness. And there you go, that's the top half of the tile finished, though I am going to lay something heavy on top, just to make sure it dries nice and flat. Okay, now the bottom half of the tile, that comes with 4 interchangeable options. That's these 4 that you can see here. And to make those, we'll first glue one of the textures to some single corrugated card again, and, not surprisingly, cut that to size. So, there you go. But, as you can see, I've not cut the corner sections out just yet because if you're running low on cardboard, you can flip it over and glue one of the other textures to the back. And that's exactly what I've done with this piece here. So, here's the front, and there's the back. And don't worry too much if it's not perfectly aligned. Anyway, once both sides are fully dry, and it's a good idea to rest a heavy book on top while they do, we can then cut out the corner sections from the side that we glued into place first, like you can see me doing here. So, there you go. And then, the last thing we'll need to do for this piece is cut out 4 little squares of thick card that are a bit less than a ½ inch square. They're probably closer to the sizes that you can see here on the screen. And all we're going to do with those is glue them into the 4 corners of the top part of the tile, as you can see. And I'm just using a bit of PVA glue for this, for a slightly stronger bond. Then, if I bring in one of the bottom halves, and once the top piece is dry, you can see how these little squares will help to lock the 2 halves together. And if I flip the bottom piece over, you can see how we can use this to make a number of different tiles without having to go through the trouble of cutting out the broken edges of the top piece each and every time. So I'll just quickly swap that out for the other bottom piece, so that you can see how that looks, and that's the lava side, and if I flip it over, there's the water side as well. And that's the main part of the room done. Right then, there's still a few more bits and pieces to go along with these, but I've kept these pretty simple as there's a chance they won't actually get used in the adventure. But for this first piece, we'll take this dirt texture, and we'll glue that to some thick card, just using a regular glue stick again. Then, once it's dry, we can use the guides to cut out 5 1-inch squares. But for now, we'll only need 1 of those. Okay, next we'll cut out this texture, and we'll fold that in half, and we're going to be gluing that to either side of some thick card. So I'll go ahead and do that now, first applying plenty of glue to the back of the paper, and then, as I say, sticking that to either side of the card. And, as usual, here's one that I've made off camera that's had plenty of time to dry. Anyway, next we'll trim away the excess from around the edges, and cut ourselves a strip that's around 1 inch or 25mm wide. Then, from this strip, we're going to cut out lots of little pieces that look a bit like shards of broken glass, and these are going to represent rock crystals that are kind of bursting up through the ground. So we will need to keep that in mind and try to make sure that the bottom of each piece is nice and straight. And from your perspective, the bottom is the side that's facing the top of the screen. So there you go. That should be more than enough. And I've made sure that they're all different shapes and sizes. Then, for the assembly, I'm just going to squirt some super glue onto a bit of scrap card, and then dip the end of each piece into that glue and stick it to the base. And that's how these first two pieces look. That's the kind of thing that we're aiming for. Anyway, I'll leave the video running while I add the rest, and as I say, it's just a very quick and easy way of making it look like there's crystals sticking up out of the dirt, rather than the more complicated version that I made back in the cave tile videos. Though, you could make them that way if you prefer. It's just that, as I said earlier, there's a chance that these won't actually get used, so I didn't want to spend too much time on them. But yeah, this is what it should look like when it's finished. And there's enough of each texture to make 5 of those. Now, for the very last piece, we can take the whirlpool texture and glue that to yet more thick card, and then simply cut those to size once they've had plenty of time to dry. And that's pretty much it for the crafting part of this next room, so it's time to move on to the encounter itself. So, if you remember, at the end of the last episode, the characters will have faced off against 3 different elemental creatures, one issuing from each of the portals in the room. And, as I said in that episode, the PCs can only pass through one of these portals, and as soon as anyone does, the other 2 portals turn to stone. I also pointed out that the GM will need to keep track of which creature came out of which portal, because if the PCs pass through the portal which the fire creature came out of, for example, that portal will then lead to the lava room. Whereas, if they go through the portal that the water elemental came from, that will lead to the flooded room instead. And so on. So, the party are only ever going to face one of these encounters, but I'll run through all 4 of them anyway because, it's going to be the player's actions that dictate which one actually gets used at the table. Hopefully all of that made sense. Okay, so for all 4 of these rooms, there's going to be a few standard features that remain the same throughout. And these include things like, when a character emerges from the portal, they'll find themselves in a short passage that leads into a long room. On the other side of that room is a very obvious stone doorway that they'll need to get to. The floor of the room between them and that doorway has fallen away, though bits still cling to the edges. And anyone that tests the stability of these perimeter stones, we'll call them, they'll find that they just fall away as soon as any real pressure or weight is applied to them. So yeah, that's the basics of each room. But in this particular one, the PCs will find that there are still a couple of areas where the floor still stands, and between these kind of pillars almost, old planks of wood have been tied together and nailed into place to make a makeshift bridge. It's also very much apparent that there's strong gusts of wind blowing around inside this room. It whips up the dust, rattles the planks and whistles through the cracks in the stone, things like that. But it doesn't seem to come from any one direction in particular. It's a little bit random, you might say. And like I mentioned earlier, the aim is to simply cross the room, which can be done in a couple of different ways. So I'll just quickly put a character token on the screen, and the main way across is going to be fairly obvious. A character can simply use the walkways to get to the other side. However, we're not going to call for any kind of jump rolls or anything like that. We're simply going to treat the ruined floor and the rickety walkways as difficult terrain. So, in most games, that's just going to slow a character's movement. So, let's say one of the PCs uses all of their movement to get to there at the start of each round, and it's probably best to drop into combat rounds for all of these encounters. We're going to roll a d4 and see which direction the wind is blowing from for the entirety of that turn. Then, any character that's in the room, they'll need to make a suitable saving throw to avoid being blown 5 feet, or 1 square, in that direction. Possibly 10 feet, if they roll really badly. So, sometimes this will mean that a character is moved backwards or forwards along the bridge. Other times, it'll mean that they lose their footing and tumble down into the hole, taking falling damage when they hit the ground. From there, they can probably make their way underneath the bridges to the other side of the room without further incident, though they'll then need to climb back up. And speaking of which, that's another option that the players might go for. i.e. they might choose to ignore the bridges altogether and simply clamber down into the hole and then back out on the other side. And if they do this, the roll should be a bit more difficult than normal, as they'll have both the wind and the fragile nature of the crumbling floor and walls to contend with. You could even have something nasty waiting for them down at the bottom, if you really wanted to. But yeah, there'll be other ways that the players think of, they always do, but that's the basic idea. It's just a simple, make a save to avoid falling into a pit kind of thing really, but one that's hopefully a little bit more interesting than your bog standard pit trap. Right then, so if I continue in alphabetical order, we'll do the Earth room next. And this time, when the party exits the portal, they'll find a room where the floor lies in ruin. It's mostly just dirt and broken stone at this point, and it appears that they can cross with relative ease. So let's just drop a token on again. And this time, each time a PC enters one of the squares of the room, we're going to roll a d20, or you could have the player roll if you like. And as long as it doesn't come up with a 1 or a 20, nothing happens. Well, maybe you could say that nothing happens on an even number, but the ground trembles ever so slightly on an odd number. Either way, nothing of note really happens. But, like I say, if a 1 is rolled, then jagged rock crystals burst up out of the ground, forcing a character in that space to make a saving throw or suffer damage from the razor-sharp rocks. And to represent these, we can use the scatter pieces that we made earlier. Now, the party will either have to go around it and any more that appear, or, if they somehow manage to get cornered, make a slightly easier roll to pass through any spaces that contain these sharp crystals. Anyway, let's assume that our PC makes it all the way to here, and then rolls a 20. What we'll do then is we'll randomly determine an empty space adjacent to that PC, let's say we use a d8 because there's no one else around them, and we get a 3, then in that square a huge column of rock crystal bursts from the ground and crashes into the ceiling, shattering into hundreds of razor-sharp shards that rain down on all of the surrounding area. And, not surprisingly, anyone in that area will now be required to make a saving throw to avoid taking damage. And it might mean that more than one character is affected. And once we've resolved all of that, we can then place another of the scatter pieces to represent all that remains of the column. And after that, the players can then attempt to cross the rest of the room. So yeah, that's pretty much how the Earth Hazard works. Okay, as you can see, this version of the room is filled with boiling lava. But just like we did before, we're not going to turn this into a jumping challenge, we're just going to assume that if a character is careful, they can cross without too much trouble. We'll just call it difficult terrain again. So, being difficult terrain, it's probably going to take most characters a couple of rounds to cross. So, what we're going to do is, at the start of each round, we'll roll 2d8 and total the result. So, let's say we rolled an 11. We'll then consult the numbers printed on the tile itself, and we'll describe how the lava kind of bubbles up violently in that spot, spewing a little bit of molten rock onto all the adjacent squares. And anyone unfortunate enough to be standing in one of those squares, they'll need to make a saving throw to avoid being burned. In addition to that, you might also like to judge that if a double is rolled, for example, you roll 2 3s to get a result of a 6, then the lava is particularly active in that area, and it could either deal double damage, or perhaps it showers a larger area. It's up to you. And you can, of course, add in any other factors that you think might be appropriate, like poisonous fumes or ongoing heat damage, things like that. I'm just providing an overview here really. So this last room is, as you can see, filled with deep water, and to reach the other side, the characters will likely need to swim across. So swimming in most games is treated like, wait for it, difficult terrain. You might have noticed a bit of a theme running through most of these rooms. So again, the characters are probably going to spend a couple of rounds in the room itself, and this time the hazard is going to be 1 or 2 small whirlpools, which we'll just place near to the centre of the room to start with. Then, at the beginning of each round, we'll roll a d10 for each of them to see which way they move, if at all. So, in this example, the first one moved to the northeast, and then, with the roll of a 5, the second one, that's going to move directly south. And we'll just repeat that each and every round. Then, when a character is making their way across, if they pass a square adjacent to a whirlpool, or the whirlpool moves adjacent to them, then they're going to need to make some kind of strength-based save or skill check to avoid being pulled in. And Any character that finds themselves pulled into the centre of the whirlpool, they'll suffer minor damage at the start of each of their turns until they can make another save or check to break free. So this is a pretty simple one, though doubtless there's opportunities here for players to complicate things and possibly make things easier or even harder for themselves, but that's always going to be the case. Anyway, whichever room the PCs end up having to deal with, they should eventually find themselves at the stone door on the other side. And once they've got there, they'll notice that, as well as there being strange writing carved into the door, there's also 2 hand indentations. And in the centre of each palm is an elemental symbol, though what kind is going to depend upon the player's choices so far. But I'll talk more about that and the final room in next week's episode. So thanks for watching again. As I say, next week I'll release the final episode in this series, so I hope to see you there. Bye for now.